John Deere was once a symbol of America's heartland, a name that meant trust, loyalty, generations of hands building something greater than themselves. But now that symbol is cracking. Layoffs. Outsourcing. The same company that helped shape rural America is now accused of abandoning it, and the people who made it great are demanding answers. What happened to the promise? What happened to the pride? This isn't just about one factory, this is about a movement, and the question that could define a legacy: will John Deere stand with America or sell it out? The corporate betrayal. John Deere's announcement to relocate a significant portion of its manufacturing operations from Iowa to a new facility in Ramos Arizpe, Mexico, sent a seismic jolt through the American agricultural sector. The move struck at the heart of rural identity, where the Deere brand had long been synonymous with American farming strength and local pride. Farmers and factory workers who had remained loyal for decades now felt discarded, particularly as the company shifted the production of compact construction equipment away from U.S. soil. While Deere positioned the decision as a strategic realignment, aimed at improving global logistics and production efficiency, for many in the heartland, it was more a symbol of corporate disloyalty than corporate evolution. The decision came at a politically sensitive time, prompting an immediate reaction from former President Donald Trump. Seizing on the growing discontent, Trump used the news as a rallying cry, accusing Deere of undermining American workers and threatening a 200% tariff on imported Deere machinery. This hardline stance resonated in communities still reeling from a wave of layoffs, where over 1,800 Deere employees had lost their jobs in 2024. Trump's call for economic nationalism echoed the deep frustrations of many who felt abandoned by the very corporations they had built their livelihoods around. His campaign trail speeches painted Deere's offshoring not just as poor economics but as a betrayal of national loyalty. Indeed, Deere touted investments worth billions of dollars in U.S. factories since 2019, underlining their commitment to focusing domestic operations on higher-value work. However, this attempt to patch up the damage could not be pulled off. Rural Americans were seeing a more expansive phenomenon: big agribusinesses, from meat packers to grain merchandisers, reducing their domestic footprints in favor of labor cheaper abroad. It counted up for communities already stretched to find an edge economically in terms of slowly evaporating industrial self-reliance and security. Such a pivotal point had now come in the corporate history of Deere, an even deeper crack, this time in the farmer-manufacturer relationship. Farmers could no longer find themselves in the legendary green and yellow machines, raising doubts as to whether the brand continued to subscribe to their values. This was neither production lines shifted to Mexico nor relocated factories, it rather relocated the public sentiment. For many, the term John Deere became no longer a badge of pride but an outstanding example of how legacy companies could abandon their roots in pursuit of global margins, leaving American towns alone to weather the fallout. Deere's decision may have uprooted faith in the fields, but its impact on the factory floor ran even deeper. Labor collapse. John Deere's pivot to offshore manufacturing not only rocked the farming community, it shattered the industrial ecosystem that supported it. The relocation of operations from the Dubuque Works facility in Iowa to Mexico triggered widespread layoffs, gutting long-established workforce pipelines across the Midwest. In towns like Waterloo, Moline, and Horicon, the layoffs didn't just reduce employment, they disrupted entire local economies that had developed symbiotically around Deere's presence. Multi-generational employees suddenly found themselves adrift, losing not only income but identity in a community once defined by factory shifts and lunch breaks outside the plant. The emotional toll quickly gave rise to organized resistance. Workers gathered outside locked factory gates with signs demanding job security and corporate accountability. Labor unions, including the United Auto Workers, galvanized their base, staging strikes and lodging formal complaints about unfair labor practices. These weren't just protests, they were public indictments of a corporate decision that prioritized shareholder interests over decades of worker loyalty. The movement's power came not only from anger but from the palpable sense of betrayal that ran through communities built around factories that now sat idle and silent. After this anger moved into the political arena, factory workers pulled in new allies from the farming community. United by common grievances against Deere's outsourcing and the wider devaluation of American labor, the two groups forged a potent coalition. Their common message resonated at national level: America cannot live on imports alone. The Buy American campaign was dusted off as rural and blue-collar voters began to push candidates about the accelerating decimation of domestic manufacturing. What began as insignificant protests turned into a flashpoint in wider conversation about economic sovereignty. The long consequences were dire. With factories closing, businesses that had depended on foot traffic to mechanics and local grocer began to shut down like dominoes. School funding was cut, relying on property and business taxes. Home prices began to go down. The stability of the community began to be undermined by the corporate pullouts. At the same time, the rapid development of the Mexico facility glaringly highlighted the inward focus on investment preferred and at what expense to humanity. For many in the Midwest, Deere's departure was more than a strategic decision, it was a point of no return. The death of organized labor made it brutally clear that corporations no longer felt an obligation to American workers, and communities would have to fight for their survival in the new economic order. Farmers' revolt. As John Deere's manufacturing shift deepened the disillusionment among factory workers, a parallel uprising took shape in the fields. American farmers, long the bedrock of the company's success, launched a defiant boycott in response to rising equipment costs, limited repair options, and what they perceived as a betrayal of rural values. The iconic green and yellow logo was painted over or removed entirely from barns and sheds across the Midwest. This symbolic act marked the collapse of brand loyalty, a rejection of a legacy that farmers now felt no longer served their interests or needs. What started as scattered individual acts of protest quickly evolved into a coordinated national movement. Farmers mobilized on social media, in town hall meetings, and in forums to share repair tips, alternative brands, and calls for accountability. Ditch the Deere became a rallying cry, echoing through online communities and physical protests outside Deere dealerships. The uprising wasn't only fueled by corporate decisions, it was accelerated by broader economic policies. Trump's aggressive trade tariffs had raised input costs and disrupted markets, and Deere's pricing and repair practices added insult to injury. The convergence of these forces created the perfect storm for rebellion. Outside of the United States, events were blowing more wind into the sails. In Canada and Europe, tariffs further added fuel to the fire of anti-American sentiment fed by frustrations toward multinational corporations, Deere included. Local buy campaigns sprung up, and consumers were using apps to identify and avoid US-made goods. These actions were not merely nationalistic but aimed at empowering local economies to break free from dependence on foreign corporate agenda. U.S. farmers have done source leverage their growing discontent and started pushing their own agenda. American agriculture should serve people, not profit. For Deere, the consequences began to play out quite immediately and on a large scale. Once great dealerships started reporting declining sales and eroding consumer loyalty. Farmers, already burdened with high costs and too little support, could not see any advantage in holding on to a brand that they perceived as having turned its back on them. It was a revolt against far more than just tractors, it was against a system that, in the eyes of farmers, had put profit margins before community well-being. Farmers started to support brands that honored transparency, opened their repair access, and shared their values. From here on, consumer behavior in the rural areas shifted gears, a clear indication that even the most iconic brands are susceptible to the wrath of consumers when they lose touch with those who have built them. Right to repair and the power struggle. The fight for the right to repair has become one of the most explosive issues in modern agriculture, redefining the relationship between farmers and the corporations that supply their tools. Central to this battle is John Deere, whose modern equipment is now so software-driven that traditional maintenance has become virtually impossible without manufacturer intervention. What used to be a matter of wrench and know-how has become a question of access to proprietary software and encrypted diagnostics. For farmers steeped in a tradition of independence and self-reliance, this shift feels less like innovation and more like captivity. The stakes are especially high during critical planting and harvesting seasons. A broken-down tractor in spring or a combine failure during harvest can cost thousands of dollars in lost yield within hours. Yet, under current restrictions, farmers must wait days, sometimes weeks, for authorized service. This delay is not for lack of technical skill, but due to software locks that prevent even experienced operators from making basic repairs. For small and mid-sized farmers operating on razor-thin margins, these delays can mean the difference between profit and ruin, amplifying the urgency of reform. Litigation will take due course at this point. In 2018 and in 2024, lawsuits were filed against John Deere on antitrust grounds, saying that the company was preventing access to parts and diagnostics purposely to monopolize the repairs. Deere cited safety concerns and intellectual property protections as justification for what critics derided as thinly veiled profit maximization. While a 2022 agreement with the American Farm Bureau Federation promised greater access to repair materials, there was no enforcement mechanism and thus did not quell demands for consumer protections. The bigger issue remains: do farmers really own the equipment they buy, or, as many claim, are they just leasing it in all matters save name? Now this discussion has grown well out of the fields. Bills have been introduced in state legislatures around the country aimed at adopting right-to-repair laws, supported by groups from consumer rights advocates to independent repair shop owners and bipartisan coalitions. It offers promises to open some deeper conversations around tensions involving corporate power, digital rights, and rural autonomy. For the farmer, it is not just about repairing, but reclaiming ownership of work, time, and future economies. The legacy performance of this battle will shape agriculture's future generation into most profound and long-standing ways, whether by changing or resisting adaptation. Automation divide. John Deere's strategic pivot toward robotics and automation promised a leap forward for agricultural productivity, but in practice, it widened the chasm between industrial-scale agribusinesses and the small farmers who form the backbone of rural America. The rollout of self-driving tractors, AI-integrated sprayers, and precision software was hailed as a revolution, but one priced well out of reach for most independent farmers. With some autonomous equipment exceeding $500,000, only the largest farms with deep pockets and access to financing could even consider adoption. Instead of democratizing access to innovation, this wave of automation entrenched existing inequalities. For small and mid-sized farmers, many of whom were already drowning in debt from rising input costs and inflation, Deere's high-tech offerings served more as a reminder of their limitations than a tool for transformation. The technology often came bundled with proprietary platforms, mandatory service agreements, and licensing fees that created long-term financial obligations. These barriers made even basic digital upgrades difficult to sustain. At the same time, aging machinery became more expensive to maintain, and repair costs soared, pushing already strained farmers closer to the edge of solvency. While large farms were modernizing their lives to maximize yield and minimize labor, rural communities found themselves under parallel pressure. Work that had formerly been associated with seasonal farm labor or full-time farm labor began to disappear. The youth, seeing little promise in the agricultural avenue, kept migrating to the urban centers. Among many erstwhile farming towns, this accelerated demographic decline, where an aged population and less school enrollment comprise existential challenges in their own right. The equipment that was meant to alleviate the industry of its labor woes was only hollowing out whatever remained of its social fabric while exacerbating the very issues it was purported to alleviate. The chasm between those who could access advanced ag-tech and those left behind painted an egregious picture of modern farming. Deere's vision of the future would come to be, for so many, a future without them. Unless federal subsidies are targeted toward cooperative models and small-scale operators with affordable alternatives, automation threatens to become yet another wedge splitting the agricultural landscape. The promise of innovation can only be realized if it includes the very stewards of the land who most need it. If not corrected, the automation divide has the potential to not only shift agriculture but to shift the very definition of who gets to participate in it. As tech widened the gap, another invisible force quietly unraveled the foundation of America's harvest. The immigration meltdown. The Trump administration's renewed immigration crackdown in 2024 sent immediate shockwaves through U.S. agriculture, particularly in regions dependent on migrant labor for crop cultivation and harvesting. For decades, the majority of farm labor in America, especially in fruit, vegetable, and specialty crop production, has been performed by immigrant workers, many of whom were undocumented. With stepped-up deportations, worksite raids, and the narrowing of agricultural visa programs, that workforce began to vanish. What followed was not just a labor shortage, but a collapse in the entire supply chain that moves food from field to fork. In states like California, Arizona, and Florida, the consequences were painfully visible. Entire fields of produce were left to spoil as farmers reported they couldn't find workers willing or able to fill the roles vacated by deported laborers. Even aggressive recruitment efforts, including wage hikes and incentive bonuses, failed to attract sufficient replacements. Most domestic workers, unfamiliar with the grueling nature of farm labor, declined the jobs outright. Farmers were forced to plow under crops rather than harvest them, a catastrophic waste that cost the industry billions and drove national food prices higher. The missed harvests were only a segment of the economic cost. Small farmers unable to sustain high wages because of tariffs and soaring costs of inputs now have to bear the brunt of labor costs required to stay competitive in a labor-scarce market. Those who were in a position to operate with a skeleton staff usually faced reduced volumes, missed delivery contracts, and closure in the long run. Moreover, federal assistance directed toward labor-stressed farms was sluggishly behind the pace of the crisis, aid packages being retarded by bureaucracies or not making their way to the tiniest producers in time to care. Most catastrophic of all is the epiphany the nation's labor meltdown has shown, the fragility of the system itself. Modern machinery and technology models that create agriculture almost wholly rely on human hands to harvest delicate crops and maintain food safety standards. Trump policies may be popular in certain political spheres, but they more than clearly demonstrate American agriculture's dependency on immigrants, legal and illegal, for nearly every sector. As food skyrocketed into garbage and store shelves emptied, the society would grapple with an uncomfortable truth: without a stable, legal pathway for labor migration, U.S. agriculture cannot sustain itself. Tariff domino effect: the return of sweeping tariffs under President Trump in 2025 hit American agriculture like a freight train, triggering a chain reaction that sent equipment costs soaring and supply chains into chaos. A blanket 10% import duty, coupled with targeted tariffs of up to 125% on major trade partners like China, Mexico, and Canada, quickly raised the cost of vital machinery and components. Farmers, already burdened by decades of economic volatility, found themselves priced out of even basic equipment upgrades. John Deere and other manufacturers, facing increased production costs due to their reliance on global supply chains, passed those expenses directly to their customers. The result was a seismic shift in the farm equipment market. With the price of new tractors and harvesters doubling in some cases, farmers turned to used machines as a stopgap. But that demand quickly dried up supply, inflating prices for 10 to 20-year-old equipment and putting even second-hand models out of reach for many. More troubling was the shortage of critical replacement parts, often sourced from tariff-hit regions. What once was a routine maintenance issue now became a season-delaying crisis, with farmers left waiting weeks for shipments that might never come. A wound to start with was made even deeper by retaliation from some of America's closest trading partners. Canada, outraged over the sweeping tariffs, announced an end to its centuries-old trade partnership with the U.S., while China responded by raising duties on American agricultural produce, directly fastening a loss of key export markets. The retaliation fell most heavily in the Midwest, especially in places like Minnesota and Iowa, where almost 50% of their agricultural exports were agonizingly cut off with heavy restrictions abroad. Long-standing supply contracts were torn apart, and farmers dependent on international markets for their livelihood began to realize that they were now reduced to being a bystander in an international economy they once actively engaged in. There were claims made by the administration that tariffs would lead to more production within the country, but this soon proved to be mere words. By the end of 2024, tariffs added less than 2% to federal revenue, with damages disproportionately upon rural economies. The destruction of established trade channels and soaring input costs pushed many family farms over the edge into bankruptcy. In the meantime, large corporate agribusinesses were able to ride out these turbulent waters, thanks in part to financial capital and international diversification. What began as a ploy of economic leverage transformed into an illustration of unintended consequences, an episode during which farmers ended up suffering due to policies they were not allowed to shape. Crop price collapse amid the turmoil caused by tariffs, labor shortages, and equipment inflation. American farmers faced another blow, a steep and prolonged collapse in global crop prices. Beginning in 2022, key agricultural exporters like Brazil, Argentina, and India flooded international markets with record-breaking surpluses of corn, soybeans, and wheat. These nations, many of which had expanded production with state support and new technologies, undercut U.S. prices by up to 30%. By 2024, global demand could no longer absorb the excess, and prices plummeted. Corn fell 37%, soybeans 24%, and wheat 35%, devastating numbers for an industry already running on thin margins. This wasn't just a market correction, it was an existential threat to American farming as we know it. U.S. farmers who had borrowed heavily in prior years to expand acreage or purchase equipment found themselves unable to meet debt obligations. Banks, spooked by falling commodity values, began tightening credit lines and demanding repayment. Without access to capital, many farmers couldn't even afford the upfront costs of planting for the next season. The ripple effects cascaded through rural economies, gutting local equipment dealers, co-ops, and grain elevators that depended on stable harvests and steady traffic. Some farmers tried to increase production to overcome the recession by raising production to make up for the low price per bushel, but this only added to the surplus and sent them spiraling downhill in overproduction and deflation. This option was not open to many farmers since most did not have the required resources or market access to undertake such a feat. Meanwhile, the larger agribusinesses, cushioned by federal subsidies and global operations, continued expanding, consoling smaller farms in distress and absorbing market share with little resistance. It is a stark image which could be painted on the card of a broken system, namely, the engine of rural wealth. American agriculture is now being fragmented under the duress of global pressures and domestic policy failures. There has been a price collapse that is not only a financial ruin, but also a cultural and generational tragedy. The family farms that survived droughts, depressions, and wars now close their doors not because of bad weather or blundering, but by a world economy that no longer keeps the survival of these smaller family farms as a priority. In many corners of the U.S., the decline felt irreversible, a slow, quiet erasure of a way of life. This equally troubling picture is that there has been but little national interest in this crop price collapse outside farming communities. As urban and suburban dwellers get increasingly insulated from the realities of food production, the issues on America's farms tend to remain largely unarticulated. People in the cities don't realize we're going under, Iowa farmer Rachel Lutz said in her interview with PBS NewsHour. They still see stocked shelves and cheap groceries, but they don't know what's happening behind that. This disconnect has fostered an environment of political inertia, where very few legislators even deem it worthwhile to move beyond temporary relief measures and symbolic gestures.